The Chernobyl disaster was a nuclear accident that occurred on Saturday, April 26, 1986, at the number 4 reactor in the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant, near the city of Pripyat in the north of the Ukrainian SSR. 1-2, it is considered the worst nuclear disaster in history and is one of only 2 nuclear energy disasters rated at 7, the maximum severity, on the International Nuclear Event Scale, the other being the 2011 Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster in Japan. The accident started during a safety test on an RBMK-type nuclear reactor, which was commonly used throughout the Soviet Union. The test was a simulation of an electrical power outage to aid the development of a safety procedure for maintaining reactor cooling water circulation until the backup electrical generators could provide power. This gap was about 1 minute and had been identified as a potential safety problem that could cause the nuclear reactor core to overheat. It was hoped to prove that the residual rotational energy in a turbine generator could provide enough power to cover the gap. 3 such tests had been conducted since 1982, but they had failed to provide a solution. On this 4th attempt, an unexpected 10-hour delay meant that an unprepared operating shift was on duty. 3. During the planned decrease of reactor power in preparation for the electrical test, the power unexpectedly dropped to a near zero level. The operators were able to only partially restore the specified test power, which put the reactor in a potentially unstable condition. This risk was not made evident in the operating instructions, so the operators proceeded with the electrical test. Upon test completion, the operators triggered a reactor shutdown, but a combination of unstable conditions and reactor design flaws caused an uncontrolled nuclear chain reaction instead. 4:33. A large amount of energy was suddenly released, vaporizing superheated cooling water and rupturing the reactor core in a highly destructive steam explosion. This was immediately followed by an open-air reactor core fire that released considerable airborne radioactive contamination for about 9 days that precipitated onto parts of the USSR and Western Europe, before being finally contained on May 4, 1986. 5-6, the fire gradually released about the same amount of contamination as the initial explosion. 7. As a result of rising ambient radiation levels off-site, a 10-kilometer, 6.2 miles, radius exclusion zone was created 36 hours after the accident. About 49,000 people were evacuated from the area, primarily from Pripyat. The exclusion zone was later increased to 30 kilometers, 19 miles, radius when a further 68,000 people were evacuated from the wider area. 8-8. The reactor explosion killed 2 of the reactor operating staff. In the emergency response that followed, 134 station staff and firemen were hospitalized with acute radiation syndrome due to absorbing high doses of ionizing radiation. Of these 134 people, 28 died in the days to months afterward and approximately 14 suspected radiation-induced cancer deaths followed within the next 10 years. 9-10, among the wider population, an excess of 15 childhood thyroid cancer deaths were documented as of 2011 update. 11-12. The United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, UNSCEAR, has, at multiple times, reviewed all the published research on the incident and found that at present, fewer than 100 documented deaths are likely to be attributable to increased exposure to radiation. 13. Determining the total eventual number of exposure-related deaths is uncertain based on the linear no-threshold model, a contested statistical model, which has also been used in estimates of low-level radon and air pollution exposure. 14-15, model predictions with the greatest confidence values of the eventual total death toll in the decades ahead from Chernobyl releases vary, from 4,000 fatalities when solely assessing the 3 most contaminated former Soviet states, to about 9,000 to 16,000 fatalities when assessing the total continent of Europe. 16. To reduce the spread of radioactive contamination from the wreckage and protect it from weathering, the protective Chernobyl nuclear power plant sarcophagus was built by December 1986. It also provided radiological protection for the crews of the undamaged reactors at the site, which continued operating. Due to the continued deterioration of the sarcophagus, it was further enclosed in 2017 by the Chernobyl New Safe Confinement, a larger enclosure that allows the removal of both the sarcophagus and the reactor debris, while containing the radioactive hazard. Nuclear cleanup is scheduled for completion in 2065. 17. The Chernobyl disaster is considered the worst nuclear power plant accident in history, both in terms of cost and casualties. 18. The initial emergency response, together with later decontamination of the environment, ultimately involved more than 500,000 personnel and cost an estimated 18 billion Soviet rubles, roughly $68 billion in 2019, adjusted for inflation. 719, the accident resulted in safety upgrades on all remaining Soviet-designed RBMK reactors, of which 10 continue to be operational as of 2019 update. 2021. In steady-state operation, a significant fraction, over 6%, of the power from a nuclear reactor is derived not from fission but from the decay heat of its accumulated fission products. This heating continues for some time after the chain reaction has been stopped, for example following an emergency scram, and active cooling is required to prevent core meltdown. 22. RBMK reactors like those at Chernobyl use water as a coolant. 23-24. Reactor number 4 at Chernobyl included about 1,600 individual fuel channels, each of which required coolant flow of 28 tons, 28,000 liters or 7,400 US gallons, per hour. 25. Since cooling pumps still require electricity and must run for some time after an emergency shutdown in the event of a power grid failure, each of Chernobyl's reactors had 3 backup diesel generators. The backup generators could start up in 15 seconds, but took 60 to 75 seconds to attain full speed 25, 15 and generate the 5.5 megawatt output required to run one main pump. 25, 30. This 1-minute delay constituted a significant safety risk. It had been theorized that the stored rotational inertia of the steam turbines and the residual steam pressure could be used to generate the required electrical power to cover this gap. Analysis indicated that this might be sufficient to provide electrical power to run the coolant pumps for 45 seconds, 25, 16 not quite bridging the gap between an external power failure and the full availability of the emergency generators. 26. This capability still needed to be confirmed experimentally, and previous tests had ended unsuccessfully. An initial test carried out in 1982 indicated that the excitation voltage of the turbine generator was insufficient, it did not maintain the desired magnetic field after the turbine trip. The system was modified, and the test was repeated in 1984 but again proved unsuccessful. In 1985, a test was conducted a third time but also yielded negative results. The test procedure was to be run again in 1986, and scheduled to take place during a maintenance shutdown of reactor number 4. 26-4-51. The test program was not problematic per se, even though its documentation of safety measures would not hold up to modern standards. However, the test program developers were not aware of the unusual RBMK 1000 reactor behavior under the planned operating conditions. 4-52 It was regarded as purely an electrical test, not a complex unit test, even though it involved critical unit systems. According to the regulations in place at the time, such a test did not require approval by either the chief designer of the reactor, Nikiet, the scientific manager or the Soviet nuclear oversight regulator. 4-51-52 The test required disabling of some safety systems, in particular, the emergency core cooling system, a passive/active system of core cooling intended to provide water to the core in a loss of coolant accident, and a special approval from the chief engineer had been obtained according to regulations. 4-18. The experimental procedure was intended to run as follows.